Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope that you and your loved ones are doing okay during this difficult time for us all. My name is Susie Gelman, and I am privileged to serve as board chair for Israel Policy Forum. As always, if you are new to Israel Policy Forum, I want to welcome you. Israel Policy Forum is committed to educating policymakers and community leaders and building support for advancing a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict based on two states in order to ensure Israel's security and its well-being as a Jewish and a democratic state. If you are not already receiving our updates and analysis by email, I hope that you will take this opportunity to sign up. Also, please be aware that we recently launched Israel Policy Hub, our new collection of digital resources, which you can find at israelpolicyforum.org/hub. Even in the midst of today's unprecedented global health crisis, we are committed to continuing our work to serve as a credible resource for analysis to understand the dynamics in the region and ideas for how we may move forward to a more sustainable, secure, and peaceful future. I hope that you will all join us every Tuesday at 2 p.m. for our regularly scheduled weekly webinars. Next Tuesday, April 7th, we will speak with Amos Harel, the military correspondent of Haaretz newspaper. And on the Tuesday after next, April 14th at 2 p.m., we will have a special presentation by our good friend and colleague, Colonel Shaul Arieli, who will provide a detailed presentation regarding the implications and future of the Trump administration's peace plan. Today, we are very pleased to be joined by a very special friend of Israel Policy Forum and someone I am privileged to call friend, Tamara Cofman Wittes. Tamara will provide a wider look at the region and how it is coping and changing as a result of the current coronavirus crisis and what it might mean for the future. Many of you already know that there are few analysts as knowledgeable of the issues and as compelling an analysis as Tammy. She is currently a senior fellow at the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. She's also a co-host of Rational Security, a weekly podcast on foreign policy and national security issues. Tamara served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs from November of 2009 to January 2012, coordinating U.S. policy on democracy and human rights in the Middle East during the Arab uprisings. As always, we welcome your questions in today's discussion. If you're joining us via the Zoom link, you can click on the Q&A tab to type out your questions. If you're joining by phone, please email your questions to info@ipforum.org. We will try to get to as many of your questions as possible during the time we have today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tamara for some opening remarks, and then I'm going to kick it off with a couple of questions before we turn to the general audience. Tammy?
Susie, thank you so much, and it's great to be back with Israel Policy Forum. It's great to see that there are over 150 people on the webinar, and I hope that we will make it worth your while and have a good conversation today. What I thought I would do is give you a quick rundown on how different parts of the region, both the Arab states and Iran, are handling the coronavirus crisis, how it's affecting politics and foreign policy across the region. Because let's remember, this region was already in the middle of tremendous upheaval and transition before this public health crisis came to the fore. And so the way this plays out is going to shape the trajectory for the region as a whole, and it's going to shape the trajectory particularly for Israel with its Arab neighbors. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, and also about the relationship or the balance of power between Iran and the Arab states and the way the coronavirus may be affecting that. So let me start with Iran. Look, Iran has about 1/5 the population of the United States, but it's got at least half as many cases as the United States already, based on what's been publicly reported. They have at least 14 or 15,000 cases, and probably more. They were early victims and really struggled to create a public health policy that could manage or mitigate contagion. And so they've been severely affected. Now, Iran's economy was already devastated by the sanctions imposed by the United States after its withdrawal from the JCPOA. And primarily because of those sanctions, Iran's inability to sell any oil on global markets. It was basically down to zero. And so it was facing a currency crisis. It was having a lot of trouble financing imports of basic goods, including medicine. And in fact, a humanitarian mechanism had been set up by the international community with the support of the United States just before the coronavirus epidemic broke out. Last week, Iran made its first request to the International Monetary Fund for a loan, the first time in 60 years. It has asked for money from the IMF. It asked for $5 billion in emergency funds to help finance some of the imports that it needs to deal with the virus. As you've probably seen, there are calls for easing sanctions on Iran. There are calls for using this public health crisis as the basis for a new diplomatic dialogue. I don't see any readiness on the Iranian side for those kinds of openings, and I don't see them in Washington either. But a point I want to make, and I'll come back to this later, is that ironically, although this virus is hitting Iran so hard at a moment when the regime was already so weak, as I look across the region and the way this is playing out, I think it's quite possible that the crisis may end up putting Iran in a relatively stronger position than some of its Arab rivals across the region. And I'll come back to why I see that in a few minutes. So shifting now to the Arab world, and let's actually start with a couple of states that Lebanon, which is Israel's neighbor to the north, and Iraq, both of which have been facing intense political crises over the last year before the coronavirus appeared. These are two places where governance has been weak for a long time, and public grievance with government has been building for a long time, because they both run on essentially a sectarian or ethnic spoils system. A government that prioritizes patronage to ethnic and sectarian political movements over the public interest and over effective government service provision. So the government's ability to deliver basic services, water, electricity, trash collection, healthcare, was already weak in these places. And they've both been facing political crises since last year, massive public demonstrations in both countries. In Lebanon, at the beginning of this year, that was combined with an economic crisis and a default on government debt. Both of these countries also have a lot of travel to and from Iran. And so they were two of the earliest Arab countries to be hit with coronavirus because it was already in Iran. There are also millions of refugees and internally displaced people in both Iraq and Lebanon. Both of them host large numbers of Syrian refugees. Iraq also has millions of Iraqis who were displaced by ISIS who are not yet back in their homes. Just to touch briefly on Syria, we really don't know the situation of coronavirus in Syria. The Syrian government claims it only has 10 cases in the whole country, but that claim seems rather hard to credit. And of course, there are 5.5 million internally displaced Syrians, and at least 1 million people in the enclave of Idlib up in the north near the Turkish border who are still under assault by the Syrian government, which has been targeting hospitals, among other places. So in Syria and around Syria, that all these places that have been affected by the civil war, there really is a nightmare in waiting for people who have no access to water, no access to permanent housing, and very little access to healthcare. Moving to Israel's eastern border, Jordan has been touched by the virus relatively lightly, I would say, for the region. It's reporting about 250 cases so far. And the Jordanian government was very strong, very early, trying to control transmission of the virus. As soon as the Palestinians reported cases in Bethlehem, the Jordanians began to put curfews in place in Jordan. They tried for a few days to actually lock everybody in their houses, not even allowing them out to shop, and claiming that the government would deliver food and medicine. After about 3 days, they realized that was counterproductive because Jordanians were going out to meet the government trucks that were arriving with aid and crowding around the trucks. And so it was actually making the problem worse. So they have now loosened that quarantine, and they're allowing people out to shop in their local stores. But over the longer term, this crisis is going to add to tremendous pressure on Jordan. It's already has a faltering economy. It is already a very water scarce society. And so the government was already worried about its ability to maintain control over an unhappy population whose needs are not being met before this crisis came about. Let me take just a couple minutes and talk about what's happening in the Gulf Arab states. For two reasons I think this is important. One is because these are the countries that have been sort of quiet intelligence partners with Israel in facing regional security threats like ISIS and Iran. And so you would think that a public health emergency would also encourage cooperation. But I also want to talk about the Gulf because the Gulf states have been the ones who have been pushing back against Iran all around the region. And so their ability to do that is now being affected by this crisis. Amongst the 6 Gulf Cooperation Council states, there are over 1,000 cases distributed amongst them. Saudi Arabia has the most. It has over 1,500 cases. Now, these are relatively developed countries, relatively wealthy countries, some of them, that have very good healthcare infrastructure for their citizens. But as you probably know, a majority of the population in the GCC countries, Saudi Arabia accepted, are not citizens. They are expatriate guest workers. They live in dormitory conditions, many of them, especially the ones who work in construction and in manufacturing. They live in crowded 2 to 3 to a room in, dormitory style housing. So social distancing is really not possible. And as a result, I think we're seeing relatively quick escalation of cases, but we don't know the distribution between citizens and non-citizens, but we can assume that a lot of these cases are in the expat community. They face a lot of risks in these crises. They are already dependent for food on imports. And so when global commerce is stopped, when flights are stopped, the GCC states immediately have to worry about how do they get enough milk, how do they get enough dairy, how do they get enough meat, etc. How do they get enough grain? And again, simultaneous with this coronavirus crisis, they're facing another major economic crisis, which is the crash in oil prices. Now, partly this was driven by a quick drop in demand because coronavirus hurt Japan and China and South Korea first, and those are major oil customers for the Gulf. Global demand fell off. At the same time, the Saudis and the Russians could not come to an agreement on how to manage that. And so the Saudis decided essentially to unilaterally bump up production and drop prices to try and push the Russians, and by the way, push US shale out of the market and maximize their own income. So as a result, we're going to see extremely low oil prices for weeks or months to come until the Saudis change course. We could see oil prices down around $5 a barrel globally. And that's just shocking. And it's especially shocking for these economies when you think that the Emiratis, for example, base their government budget on an oil price of $75 a barrel. So they are burning through vast amounts of money every day pursuing this price war. And they are going to be borrowing. The Saudis are already borrowing hundreds of millions of dollars through domestic bond sales. They're going to be borrowing on international markets. Now, what does this mean for the region? Let me go back to this point about who's going to be advantaged, who's going to be disadvantaged in regional security on the far side of this crisis. the Saudis and the Emiratis had been building their regional role, their international role. They had been spending money in Jordan, in Iraq, around the region, trying to push back against Iranian influence, trying to shape the politics of the region in a direction that was favorable to them. They're going to have a lot less money to do that now. And they will have to make some very tough choices. And in fact, they were already feeling a little overextended and like they weren't getting the benefit that they had hoped to get from this regional activism. So this crisis is going to force them to reconsider whether they can try to keep pushing the region in the direction they would like it to go. They have also lost some opportunities. The Saudis were chairing the G20 this year. They are not now going to have the 20 largest economies of the world and their heads of state coming to Riyadh to demonstrate Saudi Arabia's power in the global economy. The Emiratis were going to have a World Expo in the fall. They are not now going to have 100-odd countries coming to the Emirates to showcase their global role. So I think that on the one hand, the Gulf is going to be able to do less to try and shape the regional environment. The Iranians, meantime, are advantaged in certain ways. In Iraq now, the US under pressure and with President Trump feeling like he doesn't want to remain invested there, we are now seeing our own troops pulling out of bases, moving back to Baghdad. I would predict that within a year, we're going to see a much reduced American military presence in Iraq, which gives Iran a lot more running room there. In Lebanon, Hezbollah has been strengthened. In fact, in the last government formation, Hezbollah took over the health ministry. So it is now in charge of the coronavirus response. It has given the rest of the Lebanese government its approval to seek international aid to help with the economic crisis in exchange for allowing Hezbollah to have more veto power over government policies. And so Hezbollah is now getting closer and closer, more entrenched in the Lebanese governmental system. Saudi Arabia has pulled out of Lebanon. It's no longer giving them financial assistance. And so Iran is stronger there as well. And of course, we see in Syria, the Syrian regime with Iranian help has taken over almost all of its territory again. So across, around Israel, we see the Iranian role strengthened. We see the Gulf role sort of stepping back. And when we get back to politics as usual in this region, that's going to put the US and Israel, I think, in a much tougher position in preserving our interests. So let me stop there. I'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Tamara. And again, I want to remind everybody, please feel free to ask questions. Click on the Q&A link on your screen and type in a question, or if you're on your phone, you can send an email to info@ipforum.org. So, Tammy, you've touched a little bit on some of Israel's Arab neighbors. You talked about Jordan. Could you talk a little bit about the Palestinian Authority, how it's approaching the coronavirus, the extent that we have a sense of the impact on both the West Bank and Gaza, recognizing that Hamas is in charge in Gaza? Maybe I'll split those two up. If you want to talk a little bit about first what we understand about the impact of coronavirus so far on the West Bank and the role of the Palestinian Authority, and maybe talk in addition about what, if any, cooperation is taking place between both Israel and the Arab states on the coronavirus front, and closer to home, what about Israel and the PA when it comes to dealing with coronavirus?
Thank you, Susie. Very, very important, because as we know, Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza really are not separable. They're not separable in environmental terms, they're not separable in economic terms, and they are not separable in public health terms. Some interesting things have happened in the West Bank since the beginning of this crisis. So coronavirus first emerged in Bethlehem, with a few cases. The Palestinian Authority responded very swiftly, first locking down Bethlehem in a quarantine, preventing people from traveling city to city in the West Bank, and then imposing the same kind of shelter in place regulations that we're facing here in the US or that the Israelis have imposed as well. It's interesting to note, I was talking last week with Khalil Shikaki, who is a very well-known Palestinian pollster, and he had some surveys out in the field just the first week of March as all of this was coming out, and public approval of the Palestinian Authority is actually higher now than it's been in a long time, in years, Khalil said, partly because of their very decisive response to coronavirus. So while they have been on the outs with the Palestinian public for the most part, their numbers are improving right now because people understand that they took swift action to protect public health. It's also notable that this crisis has compelled some very close coordination between Israel and the PA. As we know, there is security coordination that goes on every day, and that is helping with the population movement control, the quarantine. But Israel and the PA actually set up a joint command center to deal with coronavirus so that they can communicate quickly, take joint action, share information, and manage this crisis together because they know they really can't avoid it. One step that Israel took early and very interestingly over a week ago, as you know, there are, I think, about 25,000 or so Palestinians who are crossing into Israel every day to work, and mainly in the construction sector and the restaurant sector. And Israel allowed them to come into Israel and shelter in place at their employers' locations so that it could continue, as long as the work could continue, it would continue to help the Israeli economy and the Palestinian economy, and you wouldn't have people going back and forth and carrying the virus with them. So it was both an economic move and a public health move. With respect to Gaza, you probably all saw the news last week of 2 cases discovered in Gaza. These were individuals who had recently returned from Pakistan. Pakistan has had a major outbreak, and the government has had a very hard time putting in place control measures to mitigate it. So that vector of transmission, in a sense, not surprising. Israel has worked closely with the World Health Organization to prioritize supplies that need to get through the blockade into Gaza, and it has been stepping up deliveries of testing, of medical equipment, of pharmaceuticals, and so on. But given the density of the population in the Gaza Strip, given how many people live without electricity, without sufficient water to maintain proper hygiene, we really have to worry about the possibility of a severe outbreak in Gaza.
We have a question from Zachary Freeman. How does the Hamas-Gaza situation look? And what will Israel's cooperation or assistance there look like?
So thus far, Israel has not done anything that it wasn't already doing. In other words, the blockade regime remains in place, and Israel continues to monitor all cargo going into the Strip in the same way that it always has. As I said, it's been responsive to requests from international organizations to get certain supplies into Gaza more quickly and to prioritize those. But the Hamas governance over Gaza is unchallenged. And I don't see any reason why in the midst of this crisis, we should expect that to change. I think we've seen in countries around the world that this is a moment when people look to authorities to help them deal with a very dangerous and fear-inspiring situation. And that means that if anything, people are more willing to accept heavy-handed authority than they are at other times. There have been some rockets fired from Gaza into Israel over the last couple of weeks, and there has been some Israeli response. But I don't see any indication on either side of a desire to provoke confrontation in the middle of this crisis. Rather, they are doing what they've been doing, which is kind of a tacit cooperation.
We have a number of questions about Iran, so I'm just going to basically try to make reference to all of them. David Halperin, I think you know who he is, asks, how do you expect that COVID-19 will impact Iran's ability to operate in Syria and Lebanon? I mean, you kind of touched on that, but maybe a little bit more, both in terms of Iran's own finances and the willingness of Syrians and Lebanese to tolerate Iranian personnel on their territory, given Iran's perceived role in coronavirus's spread in the Middle East. Let me ask a couple of other questions on Iran. Robert Kantowitz wants to know, is the increase in Iranian influence likely to lead to overconfidence and overreach by either Iran or Hezbollah that is met by a massive and destructive military response by Israel or by the US? And Dan Arbel, hi Dan, says you gave a great overview. He says, I get the point about Iran in the region, but what makes you think the regime will come out stronger domestically? What do you think are the prospects for a regime collapse as a result of this crisis? And finally, Charles Kremer. Hi, Charles. If your assessment of Iran's ascendancy in their regional influence is correct, then would that not be a rationale for the US increasing its sanctions to weaken the regime as much as possible? So we've got a bunch of different questions all dealing with Iran.
Okay. These are great questions. Let me actually start with the last and work my way forward, because I think that that's the best logical flow. Look, those of you who remember the years in which we had intense sanctions on Iraq during the reign of Saddam Hussein, you will remember that while the Iraqi people starved, the regime did just fine. The military did just fine. The elites did just fine. That's because sanctions hurt the formal economy, but they also make smuggling very lucrative. And for those with the means, there's never a lack of ways to make money under a sanctions regime. The same has been true in Iran. The IRGC, in a way, they win either way, with sanctions or without. When sanctions are eased, the IRGC has more scope within the government. The government budget is under less pressure, and the IRGC can do what it likes to do, which is engage in this regional adventurism. When sanctions are tight, the IRGC is better positioned than anyone else to make money off of smuggling. They smuggle oil, they smuggle cars, they smuggle food, they smuggle pharmaceuticals. They do this on all of Iran's borders, including the maritime border in the Gulf, and they are not hurting for cash. So if you are concerned about cutting off the flow of funds to the IRGC, who are the guys who are supporting the militias in Iraq that are targeting American troops, who are supporting the Syrian regime in its conquest of Idlib, sanctions are not going to cut off that flow of funds. I wish that we had a tool that could do that, but sanctions are not going to do it. That brings me to the question of regime collapse. The tightening of sanctions, we've seen an outpouring of protest at various points in Iran, especially over the last 6 months. We have seen the regime itself engaged in a degree of infighting or uncertainty. They went through parliamentary elections with very low voter participation, and that would suggest a decline in legitimacy. But we have to remember that the backbone of every authoritarian regime is coercion. And the Islamic Republic has tremendous coercive capacity. They have not even begun to use the kinds of coercive tools that we saw them use in 2009, for example. And so I am very skeptical that economic crisis will produce regime collapse. I think that if it produces an upsurge in grievance and dissent and protest, it will also produce an escalation in state coercion to put that down. That regime has not yet begun to do what it can do to keep itself in power. Now, what does that mean for Iran's regional role, for the possibility of overreach that that question was asked? I think it's important here to distinguish between Iran and the IRGC on the one hand, and Hezbollah on the other hand. Not because they are entirely independent, but because Hezbollah does have distinct interests and it does have a degree of independence in its own decision-making. It is not merely a client, it is its own actor. Now, as I said, Hezbollah has become more tightly interwoven with the Lebanese government itself. For a long time, they preferred to be kind of behind the curtain, to have influence over the Lebanese government, but not to sit as ministers. That changed some years ago. And the trend has been for Hezbollah to have more and more formal authority. They wanted the health ministry because the health ministry is a cash cow. It is a revenue stream for them, and they could then employ more Hezbollah supporters in this vast array of hospitals and health clinics and so on. And Hezbollah also has its own capabilities, its own hospitals, its own clinics that serve Shia communities in the south and in Beirut. So Hezbollah finds itself in a position now where it is more influential, but it is also more responsible. It can no longer escape getting pegged by the Lebanese public when it fails, when the Lebanese government fails to deliver. So the protests that we saw over the last 6 months were as much against Hezbollah as against everybody else. Shias participated in the protests as well. What does that mean for Hezbollah? It means that Hezbollah actually has a lot more to lose in provoking a hot military conflict with Israel today than it had to lose 2 years ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago. That doesn't mean that they might not make a mistake. The last major Israel-Hezbollah war was the result of a Hezbollah miscalculation. So it could still happen, but from a rational perspective, they have a lot to lose. And I suspect that confrontation is not the first thing on their minds. Now, the Iranians are in a different position. If the US really does start to withdraw its forces from Iraq, hands off the Iraqi government, the Saudis are no longer interested in trading in Iraq, then Iran essentially has unchallenged influence over the Iraqi government, over oil production in Iraq, over how Iraq solves the Kurdish issue, over how Iraq deals with ISIS, and of course, Iraq's relations with neighbors like Jordan, who are important to Israel. That's a major vector for Iranian influence. And then, of course, there is Syria and Iran's efforts to embed itself on Syrian territory. I don't see any evidence that the virus has raised greater concerns among the Syrian population or the Iraqi population about Iranian influence. I'm not sure what evidence we would look for right now, but I haven't seen any. So I hope that covers most of what you wanted to get to.
Let me turn to a couple of the countries that we haven't talked about either at all or very much yet. David Yaffe asked, does Egypt fit into this equation? And similarly, Brian Burke wants to know, how has the crisis impacted Israel's relations with Jordan and Egypt? Have ties grown beyond security coordination and intelligence sharing to the public health realm?
Great questions. Thank you for asking about Egypt. I left it out of my opening remarks just for the sake of time, but it is a really, really important relationship for Israel, and it is a really important country for the way this crisis plays out in the region. Look, this is 100 million people, 40% of whom live at or below the poverty line. Like Jordan, it is a water scarce country. It is a country that's already under tremendous economic stress. It's a country where the government is already very incapacitated at delivering basic services, especially healthcare. There has been a crisis in the healthcare infrastructure in Egypt for many years. That's why they have a hepatitis epidemic in Egypt, for example. So coronavirus is kind of a perfect storm for the Egyptian government. Now, how bad is the coronavirus in Egypt? We do not know. We don't know because the government is not being transparent, not with its own public, not with the world. Officially, they have reported 650 cases. I find that incredibly hard to believe. We know that Americans came home from tourism in Egypt having contracted the virus. It is almost certainly more widespread than we know. One troubling indicator of the degree of the crisis in Egypt is that 2 Egyptian generals died of coronavirus last week. Their deaths were announced by the government, but why is this a troubling indicator? Because the military has its own healthcare system, its own network of hospitals that are open to military members and their families. It is considered one of the greatest benefits of being part of the military in Egypt is that you get access to this much better healthcare system. You had these 2 senior officers who presumably would have gotten some of the best preventive care and the best treatment in the country die within a week. The government told the public that they died, they contracted the virus as a result of helping with sanitation efforts in the city of Cairo. Now, it's very hard to imagine the 2 senior officers would have been out there, wiping down bus stations and contracting the virus. So that's just an indicator of the level at which this has affected the Egyptian military, the heart of the Egyptian state, and the level of disinformation and dishonesty with which the Egyptian government is treating it. So I worry very much about what this crisis might do for the basic stability of this government, of this economy. As far as Egyptian-Israeli cooperation, there is good cooperation beyond just the intelligence and counterterrorism function. There is tourism, there is some economic cooperation. In fact, there was an agreement, a tentative agreement for Israel to sell gas to Egypt. There is not a lot of public love in Egypt for the relationship with Israel, but there is an understanding that it's in the national interest and maintaining the peace is in the national interest. Egyptians are, however, very sensitive to the environment in Gaza, with which they also share a border. The last major Israel-Gaza war saw one of the few protests against President Sisi. Busloads of young Egyptians drove up to the Gaza border to protest Sisi keeping that border closed and to demand that Egypt give relief to Gaza when it was under bombardment from the IDF. So I think if things get very bad in Gaza, that does also raise the prospect of public dissent in Egypt.
What about Qatar? Sheridan Bahar wants to know how this crisis will affect Qatar and its isolation from the rest of the GCC.
Very good question. As you're probably all aware, there's this long-running dispute within the GCC. Qatar has been subject to a blockade by Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. The Qataris, as a result of that pressure, have built up their economic relationship with Iran, with whom they share a gas field, so they have to maintain good relations anyway. And they also invited a contingent of Turkish troops who have been sitting in Qatar for the last couple of years. The Qataris reportedly have around 700 cases of coronavirus. That's in a population of about 2.5 million. Now, only 300,000 of that 2.5 million are citizens of Qatar. The rest are expatriates, guest workers. So the Qataris have pretty good healthcare infrastructure. They have been able to manage this so far without too much trouble. And in fact, the Kuwaitis and the Qataris and even the Emiratis have been facilitating the provision of medical supplies to Iran. They've been allowing flights and ships to go across the Gulf to help Iran in its crisis. So it doesn't seem that it is stressing the Qataris at all. It also doesn't seem, though, that it is weakening the animosity between Qatar and some of its neighbors.
Continuing our tour of different countries in the region, Alexander Lungarov wants to know, what would you expect major action from Turkey in the scene you just described? What internal foreign policy or health factors may play here? And Avner Porat asked about North Africa, Morocco, Algiers, Tunisia, and the impact of COVID-19 on the relationship with Israel.
Yeah. So look, to be honest, I haven't been following the coronavirus situation in Turkey. So I'm not sure where they are in terms of their own domestic public health situation. I do expect that we've seen in the last months that the Turks have been taking a more assertive approach in parts of the region, especially in Libya, where they have been violating the arms embargo, sending weapons in to help the internationally recognized government in its war with General Haftar and his forces, who are supported by the Emiratis and Egyptians. The Emiratis and Egyptians have also been violating the arms embargo, sending weapons into Haftar. So I imagine that we will see the Turks, if they haven't already, back off that activity as they focus on matters at home and as they try to reduce potential contagion from abroad. We don't know the coronavirus situation inside Libya. Officially, they've reported 8 cases, but honestly, they probably don't know what the situation is inside their own country. The internationally recognized government does not have control over about 1/3 of Libyan territory, maybe more. And even those parts that they officially control, they don't have a lot of reach into. Morocco, Algeria each have around 600 cases. And Morocco had a lot of international tourists in the country when the crisis began. And so there's been a lot of back and forth between Morocco and the US, Morocco and European governments trying to get their nationals out of Morocco. I think there are still several thousand Americans in Morocco who are trying to get home. And as you know, international flights have been stopped in most of the region, and so it's gotten extremely difficult. Tunisia has about 350 cases so far. It has had a kind of heartening rally around the flag effect for a very fragile, very fractious new government facing a tremendous economic crisis. And so ironically, the coronavirus may give that government a little bit more room to operate. But economically, it is a really severe crisis for a country that relies, like Morocco, on a lot of European tourism.
Moving closer to Israel-Palestine, we have a few questions that are similar, so I'll combine them. Yonatan Shapir and someone else who's anonymous both asked, given that many Palestinian citizens of Israel are employed in the Israeli health system, how likely is the present coronavirus challenge, how likely is it to change relations between Jews and Arabs, Jews and Palestinians in Israel? Bob Sugarman asked similarly, what has been similarly but not the same, what has been the impact of COVID-19 in Israel, both in terms of the health situation and the political situation? So that's a little different. Susan Hochstetter says, I've heard that non-Israeli Palestinians are beginning to starve because of losing work. Do you know if that's true? So I think that the most salient question there is could this possibly have an effect long-term on relations between Israelis and Palestinians, whether they be Israeli Palestinians or West Bank Palestinians?
Thank you. Great questions. And I'll get to those. And then I realized I didn't address the question on Israel and Jordan, so I'll come back to that as well. So first on Arab-Jewish relations. Yes, it is true that the medical sector is one place where we have seen Arab citizens of Israel integrate to a greater degree than in a lot of other sectors. And the healthcare sector in Israel has always been one of the places where it's been kind of a bubble walled off from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza getting treatment in Israeli hospitals, but also Arab citizens of Israel and Jewish citizens of Israel, both working side by side in the healthcare sector and also being treated side by side in the healthcare sector. So it's long been the sort of heartening dimension amidst an Israeli society where, partly because of the rhetoric of political leaders, frankly, suspicion between the two communities has grown. I would love to believe that this is a moment where Israelis who are seeing their healthcare sector at work and appreciating its work more than is typical would come away with a greater appreciation for the contributions of Arab citizens of Israel to the health and well-being of the country. I would love that to be the case. I think it will depend in part on the attitudes that Israel's civic and political leaders take in this crisis. Do they cultivate that sense of national unity and shared mission in the midst of this crisis, or do they continue down the path of division? The rhetoric over 3 sets of parliamentary elections in the last year has grown worse and worse and worse in terms of delegitimizing the Arab citizens of Israel, 20% of the country, treating them as though their votes are to be discounted, as though their representation in the Knesset is some kind of fifth column, that they are not legitimate members of a governing coalition, that they're not even legitimate voters or legitimate members of the polity. Unfortunately, we saw even last week, you know, as Israel headed toward this very dramatic parliamentary vote for the Knesset speaker, which I know you talked about last week with Neri Zilber, even in the run-up to that parliamentary vote, Prime Minister Netanyahu and his party were maintaining some really vicious anti-Arab rhetoric in their public advertisements in the middle of the political argument that they were having with their opponents. And so I think we would need to see a change in tone from the top in order for the things that people see in society to be realized in formal politics. And without that change in tone from the top, I'm skeptical, to be perfectly frank. Let me just say, Israel has just under 5,000 cases of coronavirus right now. I understand, I haven't seen the exact figures, but I understand that they are disproportionately in the Haredi community and also in the Arab sector, but about half the cases appear to be in the Haredi community. Overall, since the crisis began, unemployment in Israel has skyrocketed. It's at about 25% officially right now. And that number probably lags actual unemployment because people haven't managed to file and report themselves as unemployed. So the Arab sector, which is already economically disadvantaged, is likely harder hit than the rest of the economy by this crisis. I guess the hope is that as the Knesset begins its work and gets in place the kind of economic relief package that Israel needs to recover from this crisis, that the significant representation of Arab members of Knesset, of the Joint Arab List, and the understanding of all members of Knesset of the contributions that the Arab sector is making in this crisis will lead to the kind of support that the Arab population needs, not only to come back from the crisis, but to continue what's been a very positive trend in human development, in education levels, in employment levels, in income levels in the Arab portion of Israeli society.
Jonah Nagy, one of our young professional leaders through IPF ATEED, asks a different question. How do you think the COVID-19 crisis could have a long-term geopolitical impact on the region? Or do you think the geopolitical dynamics will remain the same, go back to normal once the coronavirus is gone?
Okay, a few things. We've talked a lot about the dynamic between Iran and the Arab states. So that is going to be one major determinant of regional geopolitics. Another major determinant is going to be the health of the global economy. Without Asian demand for energy supplies from the region, the most capable economies in the region are going to remain flat on their backs. A third determinant is going to be the role of the United States. Now, as you all know, both by the end of the Obama administration and in the Trump administration, there was a real desire to move especially military resources out of the region, to shift the focus of American military investments to Europe and Asia, where we're dealing with a resurgent Russia and China on the rise. And it was difficult, partly because of the rise of ISIS and partly because of the region's instability. It's been difficult for the United States to actually pull back. I believe that one consequence of the corona crisis will be that the United States, under its own economic pressure, having to make some very tough choices, is going to be more inclined to pull military resources out of the region. And it's going to be stingier about providing economic and human development support in the region. Now, you and I might say that's short-sighted, but I think it's just going to be a fact of life. That raises the issue of who's left, who's going to fill the vacuum. Now, the Europeans are also major providers of assistance all around the Mediterranean, in Iraq, across the region. I don't think they are going to be as generous or able to be as generous as they've been either. And so the region is either going to fall back on its own capital, or it's going to be reliant on those multilateral institutions like the World Bank for loans. It's going to be heavily in debt. In fact, I think even the oil-rich countries are going to be heavily in debt in the years to come. And so I think that we had, before this crisis, governments that had broken social trust with their own populations, governments that had already collapsed under civil conflict. We're going to see those crises exacerbated. And perhaps it's an opportunity, finally, for governments to reach out to the private sector, really unleash the private sector, really unleash civil society so that people can come together and solve these problems in partnership. But that is not the natural inclination of most of these governments. I will say, and this is speculative on my part, but when I look across the regions of the world and I think about where major global actors, not only major military and economic powers like the US, but rising powers like India and Brazil, these are places that had begun slowly to build relations in the Middle East because they had an economic interest in doing so, and because the Middle East was playing a greater role on the global stage. But I think that this crisis may make the Middle East more of a backwater for a lot of the world. And so the problems that it has are problems it is going to have to find a way to solve on its own.
Meshulam Unger asks, how do you think the coronavirus will change the priorities of U.S. foreign policy regardless of who wins in November, similar to what 9/11 did? And what would be the difference between Biden and Trump?
Oh, well, that is a very big question. I think I just talked about a few of the changes that I think we're going to see regardless of who wins. So let me focus instead on what I think are the major differences between these two candidates. And, with full transparency, I was an Obama administration appointee. I chaired the Middle East Committee for candidate Hillary Clinton, so my politics are clear. I want to be transparent about that. But I think political identity aside, what we have is right now is 3 years of Trump's administration has left both America's friends and America's enemies uncertain about what we stand for in the world, what we care about, what we don't care about, what we are and aren't willing to do about it. It's clear we are putting pressure on Iran. It's not clear why. It's not clear what our goals are. It's not clear to our friends in the region, and it's not clear to the Iranians. And it's not clear to the Europeans who would love to figure out a way to work with us on the issue of containing Iran. So I think that the lack of coherence in American foreign policy under the Trump administration, the changeability, the capriciousness, you know, we're in Syria, we're out of Syria, we're in Iraq, we're out of Iraq, we're retaliating against Iran, we're holding back in Iran, oh, now we're retaliating again. This kind of capriciousness has left a lot of other governments just factoring us out of the equation. They are not even thinking anymore about how, you know, how to calculate what the US may or may not do. They're making their own decisions. And historically, I would say that makes for a world that is both less stable and less in the American interest, less good for us. So the president has described this as an American first foreign policy, but I actually think that it is not working to our benefit. It's working in ways that harm our interests. Vice President Biden is someone who is strongly committed to working with Democratic partners. He's strongly committed to strengthening America's alliances. He has tremendous experience in international affairs. He was chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee before he became vice president. He knows dozens of world leaders with years of engagement with them. I think he would make an early and strong investment in rebuilding relationships. But I think we have to be clear that there's no going back to some mythical status quo ante where we can re-enter the Iran nuclear deal and restart the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and rebuild a regional security framework and everything will be hunky-dory. Not only because too much has been undermined by 3 years of Trump, but also because the world has moved on. And this crisis, to me, just underscores that even more. So I think it will be imperative for the Trump administration or the Biden administration to think about a new basis for American leadership in the world, a new coalition of American partners that can work with us not only on the urgent security crises that we face, but also on things like this pandemic disease. We had an authoritarian government in China that deliberately hid the scope of this crisis from the world. And that has cost thousands of lives all around the globe and here in the United States. The value of multilateral information sharing, scientific innovation, and mutual support is driven home by this crisis. It's true for coronavirus, just like it was true for Ebola, just like it's true for climate change, just like it's true for peace and security. And so I would hope, no matter who wins in November, that we will see that theme emerge as a powerful basis for American foreign policy. But if you ask me whether this President Trump is likely to pursue that path, I think he's very unlikely to do so.
So on that note, since we're at the top of the hour, I want to first of all thank you, Tamara. As always, you've given us a lot to think about, a lot to chew over, some really great information. So thank you for, in an hour, doing such an adept job at summarizing the situation in multiple parts of the Middle East. And to all of you on the call, thank you very much for joining us. Again, reminders every Tuesday at 2. We're going to do another webinar, all with really compelling participants. So please do join us again. And finally, if you are not yet supporting our work, please consider supporting IsraelPolicyForum.org so that we can continue to bring you excellent programming and outstanding resources on our website. Thank you, and everyone have a good rest of your day. Thanks a lot.